Chapter 19. Henry. Henry stepped inside the church and tried to ignore the cold stares he received from Charles Jones and Harold Thompson. There had been nothing in the investigation that pointed to Henry or Mary, of course, but as the thief had not been caught yet, Charles still believed Henry had played a role, and Harold was still Harold. The two of them made him uncomfortable whenever he had to walk by them or share a room with them, so he avoided it as much as possible. But there was only one church in town, so Sundays and town meeting days like today, it was unavoidable. Thankfully, the two men sat in the back row, so Henry continued past them and sat down on the left with the other men. The women were on the right, and he scanned the room for Mary but didn't see her. Had she decided to stay home? He knew she was still worried about costing him customers, and that she still didn't feel like a member of the town. But she worked here, and she hoped to have a home of her own here one day, so she should have a say. Of course, he wasn't sure what his own opinion was at the moment. He could understand the benefits the railroad would bring. More supplies delivered faster would be a good thing for the store. But a railroad close to town would also mean more people, and sometimes unsavory people like Charles Jones.
"Thank you for coming out,"
Mayor Wright said, waving his hands to try and quiet the conversation. He was a larger man with a thick mustache, but he was a good leader from what Henry had seen.
"I know you've all heard about the railroad possibly coming to town, and that you have questions. I haven't always been able to answer your questions, but tonight we have Mr. Cooper from the railroad who will be able to answer them, so let's give Mr. Cooper our attention."
A thin man with slicked back black hair stepped up to the pulpit. "Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Mayor Wright, for the opportunity to speak with you. The Central Pacific Railroad is planning to expand this direction, and we think it will be beneficial for your town. It will bring greater access to goods and new job opportunities."
"But where will it be?" Carl asked. "Whose land are you going to take over, and how will you compensate them?"
"Well, we haven't set the exact location yet," Mr. Cooper said, "but we have some ideas, and we will discuss compensation with those who own the land. I assure you the railroad is committed to minimizing disruptions and making sure everyone affected is happy with the outcome."
"And what if we're not affected directly, but we're neighbors to those who choose it?" another man said. "Are you planning to compensate us as the train noise would still affect our animals?"
"Unfortunately, there is only compensation for those whose land is directly affected. But you have to remember that this is progress, and in the end, it will be beneficial for everybody." "And what about the character of the town?" Mrs. Miller, the owner of the cafe, asked. "How do we know this expansion won't bring trouble with it?" A murmur of agreement went up among the women's side. Mr. Cooper waited for it to die down before he continued. "There is always the possibility for trouble. You have that now. Could trouble come in on a coach? Sure it could. But what you don't have now is faster access. If someone gets sick and your doctor can't help them here, where do they go?"
"I'm the closest doctor for at least 4 towns. Doc Moore spoke up. "If I can't help them, then there isn't much that could be done."
"Right, but if you had a railroad, they could take a train to a big city hospital and maybe receive help there. How long does it take you to get medical supplies?"
"Several weeks,"
Doc Moore said resignedly. "And there you go. With the railroad, your supplies would come much faster, and your stores would be able to offer more merchandise and at a faster rate. Look, change is always hard, but I truly do believe there are more benefits than drawbacks."
"Well, what do you think?" Mayor Wright asked. "Do we take a vote now? What happens if we vote yes, but then the railroad doesn't follow through with what they say? Or people change their mind? Do we have any actions we can take?" another man asked. "I plan to work closely with the railroad," Mayor Wright said, "and maybe we can have a committee of a few farmers and business owners who are most affected. Would that be satisfactory?"
The man looked to his neighbors, and when they nodded, he did as well.
"I suppose it would be. All right, then. Are we ready to vote?"
Though Henry wasn't sure he was ready, no one voiced a concern, and a moment later the townsfolk had voted nearly unanimously for the railroad. Henry stood and made his way toward the door, but before he could exit, he felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Charles Jones sneering at him.
"When the railroad comes, I plan to put you out of business for good." "I thought you said there'd be business enough for the both of us,"
Henry said calmly. Charles flashed a predatory smile.
"Well, I changed my mind. I guess having your goods stolen will do that to you."
Henry shook his head.
"I didn't have anything to do with that." "So you say. I guess we'll see."
With that, he shoved past Henry and stomped out the door, Harold following close behind.
"Still having issues with them?"
Carl asked from behind him.
"Unfortunately," Henry said with a sigh, "and I don't think it's going to get any better until we find out who broke into his shop. Then let's pray God gives the sheriff wisdom."